Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to have all of you join us this afternoon to learn with us. My name is Tammy Wilson, and I'm from the Sacramento County Office of Education, and I'm the project lead for the California Dyslexia Initiative. We're really excited. We have a lot of folks from California and also other locations joining us for this afternoon and this learning opportunity. Welcome to the 2022-23 CDI Expert Webinar Series. This is the final session for this year, but we will be returning next year with an all-new Expert Webinar Series. In this series, we're really focusing on identifying risk factors, setting up effective MTSS RTI systems so that we can really prevent reading difficulties, and the importance of delivering research-based instruction to support and remediate struggling learners and students who are at risk for or with dyslexia. Today, we are really lucky and excited to learn from Joan Sedita with a focus on writing. And to support you, we have created a Padlet, which Wynn will put the link in the chat, so that you can access the webinar documents that go along with this, both the slides and a companion document that you can use to further explore the content later at your own convenience. The recordings will be posted on our CDI website within about a week of the completion of the webinar. Next slide.
Yep, one sec.
No worries.
There we go.
Sacramento County Office, as I said, is the project lead for the California Dyslexia Initiative. And on the slide, you can see our goals. One of our goals is really to provide these professional learning opportunities across the statewide system of support to really build knowledge and capacity in educators across our state. So we are excited that you're here with us. And it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to my friend and colleague, Jessica Hammond, who is the founder and CEO of Glean Education, and she's leading and coordinating the efforts for this webinar series. Jessica.
Well, thank you, Tammy. We are thrilled to partner with SCOE and the California Dyslexia Initiative to coordinate this webinar series for the second year in a row. For those of you who do not know about us, we are Glean Education, and we partner with schools, districts, and states to deliver online training, school leader consulting, and web-based coaching. Our work aims to build educator understanding of evidence-based literacy practices to improve student literacy outcomes. Next slide, please. This is the 7th in a series of webinars this year on understanding dyslexia within an MTSS framework. Next slide, please. And I am thrilled to be here to welcome Joan Sedita. Joan Sedita is the founder of Keys to Literacy, a literacy professional development organization based in Massachusetts. Joan has been in the literacy field for over 40 years as a teacher, administrator, and teacher trainer. She's authored multiple literacy professional development programs, including the Key Comprehension Routine, the Key Vocabulary Routine, Keys to Beginning Reading, Keys to Content Writing, Keys to Early Writing, Understanding Dyslexia, and Adolescent Literacy Reading. Beginning in 1975, she worked for 23 years at the Landmark School, a pioneer in the development of literacy intervention programs. As a teacher and principal and director of the Outreach Teacher Training Program at Landmark, Joan developed expertise, methods, and instructional programs that address the literacy needs of students in grades K through 12. Joan was one of the 3 lead trainers for the Massachusetts Reading First program and was a letters author and trainer. Joan received her master's in education in reading at Harvard University and her bachelor's in arts from Boston College. Please help me welcome Joan Sedita.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And for this opportunity to talk about, I love literacy in general, but writing in particular. It's something that I feel so many teachers don't have the basic background information that they need. So this is just a delight to be able to talk about this subject. Let me just go back a second. So we're going to be talking about teaching writing within a structured literacy framework, right? And before I jump into that framework, which is called the writing rope, I wanted to just give your listeners some information about where they can go if they would like to learn more about the research about effective writing instruction. You know, there's an awful lot of research about effective reading instruction. There's not as much for writing, but we do have quite a bit to look at. So while I want to make this more practical this session, and I do hope to, in addition to unpacking all the different components that should be part of writing instruction, and I will be giving some practical tips, I do want you to have a sense of where you can go to get more about the research. So what you can see on the slide here are 4 major reports based on what's called meta-analyses of research. One of the first to come out was called Writing Next. This was in 2007. And the authors looked at all the research to date about teaching writing. And what did they find was statistically significant as things that we can and should be doing to improve the writing of students in grades 4 and above. It was an excellent report. They came up with 11 things in particular. Summarizing is one that I'll mention later. Sentence combining to develop sentence work. It's a great read. The one that came after that was called Writing to Read. And this looked at all the research to date about how does writing and what things can teachers do about teaching writing help support reading. And as you can imagine, things like writing about what you're reading or what you're learning does a lot to improve comprehension. So that's another great resource. The 2 on the right are more recent. They were put together, sponsored by the Institute of Education Sciences, federal government. And there's one for elementary grades and one for secondary. This also did a meta-analysis of the research up to that date. They all are excellent sources. What I like about the last 2 in particular is they take all these findings and then they write them up in a way to help everyday teachers make connections between that research and how that would play out in your classrooms and in your teaching. Basically, what I've got are a few bullets here of findings that are consistent throughout all of these. And that is, number 1, we need to be providing daily time for writing in all subjects. Look, the only way we get good at anything is by doing it a lot. And it's no different. We get better at reading by reading a lot, and we get better at writing by writing a lot. Now, the second bullet, though, highlights that it's not enough to just have kids write a lot, right? That we have to actually, in a very explicit way, teach all of the strategies and skills and techniques that students need to use, often integrating multiple at the same time in order to proficiently write something. So the point with this is they're not going to figure it out on their own. We've got to explicitly teach it. Throughout the rest of this session, when I go through the various strands in the rope, I'll be giving you examples of explicit instruction. And, you know, given our focus here is on those students who struggle, and especially those with dyslexia, right? We know that an explicit, systematic, structured approach to teaching all kinds of literacy skills are it's what works best for these students. The third thing that's consistent in all of them, and as you saw the very first report, it's all about this, right? Is that the more we can integrate reading and writing at the same time, you know, they both rely on language skills. I've heard it referenced as they both draw from the same well of cognitive and language processes. And yet too often we see them as separate subjects. We set a certain time to teach reading and a different time to teach writing, when there's so much we can do to connect them, right? And then let's not forget about this. We'll revisit this a little bit more, but we need to make sure that students become fluent in the foundational writing skills. And that includes things like spelling, handwriting, keyboarding, and of course, sentence construction. So In a short session like this, I can't get too much more into the research, but I highly recommend, all you have to do is Google these titles and you can access the reports for free. So let's switch gears now, and I want to introduce to you this framework. My guess is that many of you are probably familiar with Scarborough's reading rope. You also are familiar with, if I hold up my hand and I say, what are the 5 components of reading? These were identified by the National Reading Panel back in 2000. Most folks who teach literacy in some way can tell you what those are, right? Phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary comprehension. And then for those of you that are familiar with Scarborough's reading rope, Dr. Scarborough kind of laid that out in a little bit more detail, sort of grouping some of those things, adding a little bit more things like syntax and so on and so forth. But the point is, when it comes to reading, many educators understand that reading, in order to be proficient at reading, students must be taught a whole collection of skills that address these major components, because ultimately the students, like strands in a rope, they need to combine all of these components, if you will, in order to fluently and automatically and successfully read. Well, what I have found over the last, 40 years, but especially the last 20, ever since this country did put more of a focus on reading, and that's been a great thing, right? We've seen with the start of the National Reading Panel and various initiatives, including Reading First, we've seen a lot more attention played to teaching reading and making sure that we set aside enough time to teach it and that we use core programs with fidelity. When I ask folks about what are the equivalent for writing, what are the components that if you're teaching writing, or if you're an administrator and you're developing a writing curriculum, or if you're looking to maybe purchase a writing instruction program, what are the components that it should have? And very often the response I've gotten is, well, it's writing. It's writing. It's like this monolithic thing. Or teachers tend to focus on one part of writing. They might jump, especially if they're in, primary grades. Oh, well, writing is about teaching spelling and handwriting. And that's true, but that's only one small piece. Or some teachers who maybe do a lot of work with sentences, they'll say, oh, we've got to teach sentences. A lot of educators, especially those who are in the upper grades and who teach subject areas, all they focus on is writing to learn. So it's about writing a lab report in science, right? Or writing how you describe a graph in math. And then there are others who tend to focus only on those skills and tasks that are related to the kinds of things students have to do on high stakes state tests. And you know what I'm referring to, right? You get a prompt, you're given several several texts or maybe a video. You're asked to search for the evidence and relevant information in the texts and the sources, and then use that to answer a prompt. And so a lot of teachers think that's all that writing instruction should be. But it's actually very multifaceted. And that's the whole idea of the writing rope framework. What we're going to do in the time we have is I'm going to work our way through each strand, share a little bit with you about what we know is effective for teaching those skills and strategies. And I hope to leave you in a couple of places with some nuggets of practical things you can start doing tomorrow with your students. So this is the writing rope itself, the big picture. If you're interested in reading more about it, I've got a URL at the bottom of the slide. I have a website where I've got lots of free stuff. And one of them is the original article blog post I wrote, where I take each piece and write it up. I wrote it up. So it's several pages long. So if you want to delve a little more into it, that's one thing that you can do. Before I move to the next slide and get into a couple more preliminary things before we hit the strands, I want to say a couple things about these. If you are on and your primary role is to teach literacy skills, you're maybe an English language arts teacher, you're a reading teacher or writing teacher, you're going to be able to connect to every strand on this rope. If you're, on the other hand, a subject area teacher, especially in grades 5 and up, there are some of the things here that probably are not your purview. So you're not going to be, if you're a science physics teacher, teaching students spelling or handwriting, right? And I would say things that fall under the writing craft strand, like literary devices, how you use dialogue when you're writing a narrative, those tend to be in the purview of English language arts teachers. However, the top 3, I hope I can convince you in the short time we have together that these are things that every teacher, every subject at any grade can play a role in. And, we need to remember that not only are our dyslexic students and those students who really struggle with writing, we're not only thinking about them, but in general, across this country, we have way too many students who are not writing at proficient levels at grade level. And so it's too much work for just specialists or reading folks or even the ELA teachers to do. So my plea is that all of you who teach other subjects can also get something out of the top 3. All right. So I do want to go over a couple of broader things with you before we jump into the actual strands of the rope. One of the things I wanted to share with you is this model. It was developed by Virginia Berninger and colleagues almost 2 decades ago. Originally, they called it the simple view of writing. A little bit later, they started calling it the not so simple view, as in this visual that I have from one of their 2006 works. It doesn't matter really what you call it. It's the concept behind it. So if you think about the top box, that's text generation. So these are all the skills and strategies that all of us need in order to write at the word level, sentence level, and broader text. And a lot of what's in the writing rope framework addresses that. Down on the bottom left, you have transcription skills. That's also one of the strands in the writing rope. But these are more literally the foundational skills that you need in order to transcribe the words onto the page. And so you need to be able to spell, and you need to be able to either write by hand or have keyboarding. What Berninger's folks did is remind us of this other really important component. It's not something you can teach students, because these things, working memory and executive functions, they're cognitive processes. So you can't teach somebody to change the cognitive functioning in their brains, right? But what you can do is provide all kinds of scaffolds and provide explicit and systematic instruction of writing. And with those tools, that then helps those students who have weaknesses in working memory and executive functions. Now, all of us, we've got strengths and weaknesses, right? Some of us, can remember things better than others, right? But we know that students who struggle, and especially those with a specific learning disability, and then more specifically dyslexia, sometimes these executive functions are comorbid with these other issues. And comorbid just means they occur at the same time. So I want you to think about the struggling writers that you work with, and try to think about how many of them, that part of what's making it difficult is the difficulty with attending to their writing, setting goals in their writing, and planning what they're going to write, and revising and self-regulating. So please keep these in mind, and note that a lot of the scaffolds will help with this. This is a quote from Steve Graham and colleagues. And by the way, Steve Graham, I think, is one of the most preeminent researchers in the field of writing instruction. Many of those reports that I referenced, he's the lead on them. But he's done an awful lot of work with self-regulation and executive functions. And I just thought this quote kind of sums up what role that plays. And I know for me, when I read this and I think about all the things that we have to do when we want to write, it's amazing to me that any of us is able to write it all. So I'll read it out loud. You can follow along. While negotiating the rules and mechanics for writing, the writer must maintain focus on factors such as organization, form and features, purposes and goals, audience needs and perspectives, and evaluation of the communication between the author and the reader. Self-regulation of the writing process is crucial. The writer must be goal-oriented, resourceful, and reflective. For skilled authors, writing is flexible, a goal-oriented and directed activity, scaffolded by a rich source of cognitive processes, right? Those strategies for planning and text production and revision. So it really is a complicated thing. I also do a lot of work. I'm an in the trenches kind of person. I'm not a researcher. Well, I've taught some college courses. I'm not a college professor. I'm out in the trenches in schools working with teachers. And, often I see a big difference when myself or my staff at Keys to Literacy, when we're doing training in schools, if it's about reading, um, most teachers feel pretty comfortable about reading themselves. If you say, hey, what are you reading today? Everybody's reading something, right? But when you say, what are you writing? Very few hands come up. And it's not unusual for us to hear from teachers say, I'm not a good writer myself. Writing was challenging. I'm embarrassed about my writing. And so I'm really afraid to teach kids how to write. So let's all remember that it's challenging for everyone. But if we can systematically and explicitly teach skills to kids, they can grow their writing skills. And so that brings us to a nice segue to this next slide. That whole notion of explicit instruction and a structured literacy approach that, again, we know students with dyslexia in particular benefit from. In order to do that, we want to follow what many of you may know as an IWU, also called gradual release of responsibility. So if we're going to teach things like how do you use transition words to connect paragraphs? How do you state your position or claim at the start of an opinion writing piece? How do you write a good conclusion? These are all skills, right? And strategies. Well, each one of those, the teacher needs to be very explicit when you present it. You want to model it by thinking it aloud with students, doing it together with them. Then we're going to move to the guided practice stage where students benefit from lots of time practicing it with feedback. And by the way, if we can have students practice the use of various writing strategies in complete writing tasks with peer cooperative groups, collaboration, that is also beneficial. We know from research, think about it, writing is a communicative kind of thing. And we know from research that when students do have an opportunity to maybe think before they write and brainstorm with a partner or take notes together or help each other as they're writing their sentences and their paragraphs, and then peer help with the editing, that it improves the writing, but it also has it become more engaging and motivating for students to keep writing. So let's always keep in mind this gradual release as we review a lot of the different strategies that I'll be talking about in the coming moments. Let's end this segment, and then we're going to jump into the rope itself with what are some common issues that we see with all students who struggle with writing, but particularly those with dyslexia. Items 1 through 6 are going to affect a lot of students, and spelling also can be problematic for many students, but dyslexics in particular are going to have difficulty with the spelling. It's a big part of what dyslexia is, right? The deficits that have to do with phonological processing are going to affect these students as they begin to learn phonics, not only for decoding words, but for spelling the words. And so you're going to see probably a lot more spelling errors with students who have dyslexia. But what other things do we see? And as the gray box down at the bottom suggests, I would like you to be thinking of other things. What do you see as common difficulties with your students who struggle with writing? And Jessica, I believe that they can add things to the chat, right? So, if you can think of some other things as I'm going through these, please go ahead and share with the whole group. So basically, our struggling writers are going to they're often going to lack critical reading skills. They go hand in hand. And this is going to affect them if they're writing from sources. They tend to have a lack of understanding of grammar concepts. And part of that means that their what we call syntactic awareness is not very strong. We'll talk more about that. The result is when they write sentences, they're very short and simple, and they're just not, they don't know how to elaborate their sentences. So we want to work on quality of sentence writing. They have a difficult time editing their own writing and the writing of others. They typically have a hard time identifying or creating a logical sequence of ideas. Their writing is disorganized. They might have great ideas, right? And great things they want to compose. And sometimes if they can do it orally, they get that all out, right? But when it comes to writing, it's just so hard to get it all down and keep it organized. So you won't see much organization to their writing. You're also going to see, even for older ones, hardly any paragraph use. They just keep writing and writing and writing and writing, and there's no natural breaks to chunk things into paragraphs. They often lack strong vocabulary. Look, kids who have difficulty with literacy, they don't read a lot, and that's how you gain your vocabulary. The more you read, the more you're exposed to written language, the more you grow your lexicon. And if you have a limited vocabulary, then that's also not only going to affect your reading comprehension, but when you go to write, you can't find the words you want to use to express what you have to say. And that can be very, very frustrating. One of the scaffolds we can do is provide students with word banks, lists of transitions they could use, lists of descriptive language and wording, adjectives, adverbs, so that when they are writing and they want to find the perfect word, they've got a resource, a scaffold. They also don't effectively use pre-writing strategies. They sort of just jump in and start. They don't take the time to brainstorm or to organize or come up with a planning tool. Alternatively, some just get stuck and they can't get started because they don't have a way to begin the process. So I'm not sure if we see any additions in the chat room, but as we keep going, if there's something that you tend to see, please add it so that others can see that. All right, now we're going to work our way through the strands. We're going to start at the bottom with writing craft and transcription. I mentioned a little bit already about the important role of fluency with handwriting and spelling. And we do know that if by the time students enter grade 4, they don't have a solid base in basic spelling and handwriting. By the way, a lot of times people ask me, should we teach cursive or not? When do we start teaching kids keyboarding? The jury is out on all that, and a lot of the experts in our field, they have differences of opinion. What I do know, though, is that if kids can't either handwrite in one way or another or keyboard, it gets really frustrating because you can't get the words transcribed. Transcription skills, I've got on the left side. So it's the handwriting. And the reason I extended the spelling to also say it's about sound symbol recall and teaching spelling patterns and sight recall of words that are not regular, right? And punctuation and capitalization. And then, of course, keyboarding. So there's, I like to make a connection, or no, that's not the best word. There's a parallel. For those of you who teach reading, you know that if students by the end of grade 3 haven't developed fluent reading skills to decode the words on the page, right? They are then putting in so much energy to figure out the words on that page that it affects their comprehension. It steals energy and thinking energy. Well, it's very similar with writing. If you're trying to write and express yourself and compose, and you have to struggle with these transcription skills, it's going to take away your energy for the composing. Now, the composing, that's on the other side, and that's really many of the other strands of the row. So how do you generate your ideas and organize them? Pick the best words to use. How are you aware of your task, audience, and purpose, right? How do you integrate reading with writing? Those are the higher level skills associated with writing. And again, just referencing the I, we, you, both sides of this slide, students require explicit instruction and guided practice. Let's delve into task, audience, purpose just for a minute here. It's often referred to as TAP. what quality writers are always aware of is who are they writing to, but also what is the task? Why are they writing this? And what is the goal? What's the purpose of their writing? And if you are thinking of these three things, it should be influencing many decisions you have to make while you're writing. How long should this be? What's the style? What kinds of words can I use? I want you to think about if you write an email to a family member, you're going to write that much differently than if you write one to your boss, right? So, and that's what good writers do. Many of our students are totally unaware of this. So this is one of the things that any teacher can be reminding students. Put up anchor charts, task, audience, purpose, right? To no matter what the kids are writing, it takes 15 seconds to say, don't forget your audience, right? So that's an important piece. Let's delve a little bit more into writing craft. What is it? This can include things, it's actually sometimes also called writer's moves. So they're techniques, they tend to be things that a writer does that is going to influence how somebody is thinking. It's sometimes referred to as the art of writing. That might include things like the writer's voice. It's called writing from the heart. I want you to think about things that you've read that make you cry when you read them, right? Or I want you to think about the first time you read a scary story and think about how the first couple lines, when it started with something like, it was a dark and rainy night, just that one sentence, doesn't it start making you feel a certain way? And that's what craft is about. It's achieved through choice of language and the way we describe things, what the settings are. I think another good example of writer's craft is how one uses dialogue. If you're writing a narrative that has characters and you have the characters speaking to one another, think about the style you choose. If you have the speakers using slang or dialect, it creates a certain emotion and information. Word choice. This is your purposeful use of certain vocabulary. And again, our students who struggle with language, they don't have a big vocabulary repertoire. So they always just use words like run, or big, instead of all the nuances that are associated with those words. We also say that we look at students writing and it looks boring, right? And we say things like, can you make it more colorful? Can you make it more interesting? But they don't know how, because we haven't explicitly taught them how to use colorful language or how to describe things in more detail. And then writing craft or writer's move also encompasses things that students, are not really developmentally ready to start learning till after grade 3 or 4, right? But they become very important as you head into high school. Literary devices. So this includes figurative language. Maybe you bring back a flashback, or maybe hyperbole, right? So this is what writing craft is. And it's why I said earlier, this probably is the purview of English and English language arts teachers and writing teachers. You don't expect a science teacher necessarily to be teaching some of this. Here's my little takeaway, practical takeaway, as it relates to this strand in the rope. If we're trying to teach kids one of these techniques, but it could also be some of the other things that I'll be talking about in a moment, the best way to do explicit instruction is to show what's called mentor models or mentor text. This is basically, we take a piece of text that's a good example of something we're trying to teach them. Let's say we're trying to teach them how to use transition words like therefore and however. Well, if we can find some good examples of text that embeds those words and we analyze them with the students and we say, look how this writer used it. And then we say, now let's see if you can write several sentences and use those transition words yourself. One of the things we know about writing, and I want you to think about your own behavior, right? We learn by modeling or emulating others. Think about a time in the last couple of months that you've had to write something. Maybe you had to write a grant. Maybe you had to write a resume. Maybe you had to write an accident report, right? If you got into a car accident. How often do you say, gee, I'd like to see how somebody else did that? And when you look at how somebody does that, we end up imitating it. And what are we imitating? Maybe the structure, maybe the style or the language, or any of those moves or techniques that might have been used. So we know that showing mentor models, this came up in the Writing Next report. We know that showing mentor models is good teaching practice. And you don't have to show them a whole book. We also can show them things about other stages. So it doesn't have to be a completed writing piece. Let's say you're trying to teach the students how to take notes from a source. Well, you might show them other students' examples of good writing of notes. So mentor models, really important. All right, now let's move to the next strand. This is text structure, and there are quite a few things that I tucked in under this strand. We're going to start with really big picture text structure, primarily the three main types of writing, but then we're going to hone it down a little bit. We're going to talk about paragraph structure and then patterns of organization, and eventually right down to the word level when we talk about transitions. Oh, let me say one or two other things about this. I said earlier that the top three strands are things that teachers of any subject can teach. And one of the things about text structure is that while we're here talking about how you teach it to help improve students' writing, when we teach text structure and analyze it within the text that kids are reading, it also improves their reading comprehension. And if you're, regardless of the subject, if you're having students read something, maybe something on the internet, maybe part of a textbook chapter, right? If you can take a few moments before they begin reading and help them analyze the structure. How did the author, what did they put in that introduction? Did they have a conclusion? How did they use headings? Why did they use headings? How did the title affect this piece? When we analyze the text that kids are reading in that way, we're teaching them to read like a writer because it will support their comprehension, but you also are then saying, guess what? You could and should be doing the same thing. So let's begin with the three types of writing. These are coming out of the Common Core and other states that have similar state standards. Very often, the three first writing standards tend to be about the three main types of writing. They're also called genres. So that includes opinion writing, which we usually describe up through the elementary grades. When kids move into middle and high school, it then starts moving into more formal argumentative writing. But what do they both have in common? It's convincing. The next type is informational, and then the last is narrative. A lot of our kiddos do not get the differences among these three types. And so a simple little graphic organizer like this as an anchor chart can be really helpful. When they have a writing task, part of the question is, which of these three types is the best genre for me to use? If I'm answering a prompt on a high stakes test that's asking me my opinion and I have to use evidence from sources to back it up, then kids need to know that, oh, I got to start moving into the text structure for opinion writing. So they really do vary. But we also have to teach students that sometimes we even blend these. If you think about an editorial in a newspaper, they might start off with informational, giving you some facts. They might move into narrative. Let's say it was a crime and they're going to tell you the events that happened. And then they're going to end up with opinion because it's an editorial. So we also want kids to know that they can sort of mix and match these. Now, one of the most fundamental things about the three types of writing is that kids recognize, regardless of the type, they have to have an intro, a conclusion, and they got to develop the body. I mean, it's as basic as it comes. And if you look often at the standards, writing standards, they not only have the three main types, but then within them, they've got a lot of substandards about what an introduction should do for an opinion in fourth grade versus what it should do in high school, right? or how the body gets developed differently for an informational piece than from a narrative piece. So we want to be teaching students about these major functions of text structure. We do it by analyzing model text, but we also can help them by providing a scaffold. Now, how many of you are familiar with what's often referred to as the five components of, the 5 paragraphs of a 5-paragraph essay, right? Intro, conclusion, 3 body paragraphs. Now, there's nothing wrong with that because I think it does a good job of reminding students that they have to have intros and conclusions. The problem is if that's all you stick with, it's why we have a lot of kids entering college and their professors say all these students do is write 5-paragraph essays. It's not flexible enough. So I'm going to share with you a graphic organizer that my colleagues and I developed about 10 years ago at Keys to Literacy. And I hope you'll be able to walk away with something you can start using your students that's a little more flexible than the 5-paragraph essay. It begins with the default that you see here. You give the students those shapes that you see. Topic, they fill in the topic they're writing, and for opinion and informational, they're going to put the topic. Then you've got intro, body, conclusion. They're markers and they're reminders, right? Once they start brainstorming what they're going to write about, they start to fill in the rest. And the easiest way for me to show you in a moment, I'm going to give you some examples and classroom examples. If you're writing a narrative piece, the topic web will start a little bit differently. It will have your title, but then you're going to have beginning, middle, end. So let me walk you through some examples. Let's say we're writing an informational piece. It's short. It's going to be a few paragraphs long. So your topic web, this is a generic one, but let's say the topic was pirates. So they put pirates up at the top. Under introduction, they'd have a phrase that they're going to use to build off their introduction. They might add a lead, an interesting question, but we got to make pirates in there, right? Our conclusion, we're going to restate something. There are many types of pirates. Our body, though, this is where we think through. Informational text is based on topics and subtopics. So when we know the information we're going to write about, we have to chunk it into topics or main ideas. So going back to pirates, we might have 4 different kinds of pirates we want to write about. And so we'll have 4 boxes under the body, and each one will represent main ideas and details about a different pirate. So in this case, this would be a 4-paragraph body with maybe a sentence in the beginning and a sentence at the end for the intro and the conclusion. Let's say we're writing something longer. In this case, this is a 6-paragraph piece. Well, once you start getting that much information in the body of an informational piece, you want to start to chunk it into sections. By the way, when the students start writing this piece up, where you see the 2 ovals, that's where they're going to give a heading to help the reader see the 2 chunks of their informational piece. So let me show you some classroom examples. This is a middle school. You can see the teacher gave the students the default shapes and the student built this out. Reminder that their intro is about how rocks are formed. They're writing about 3 ways they're formed. This piece might turn out to be anywhere from 3 to maybe as much as 7 or 8 paragraphs, depending on how much detail they decide to add. Here you can see one from high school. The students are writing about the Axis powers in World War II. Again, this is not where we get all the details. It's where the students brainstorm and plan the big picture. All right, so what does this look like when we start doing it for opinions? Well, opinion is set up differently. We still have to introduce and we need a conclusion, but we also have to state our opinion. And the body is going to be organized by the reasons we use to support our opinion. So for example, in this example from a grade 4, the student has the claim stated and has come up with 3 different reasons to support why students should have 2 recesses a day. If we get into more argumentative, we also have to add a part in the body for a counterclaim and a rebuttal. And here you can see that with a high school topic web. Claim is continue funding for NASA. The student is giving 2 reasons, and they are reminding themselves that they need a section for counterclaim and rebuttal. And last but not least, this is how the narrative would map out. In the beginning, we establish our situation. You introduce a narrator, maybe the setting, right? A character. Closure wraps up the story, but how's the body built out? It's built out by the events we want to write about. So I hope you found that helpful. I'm going to say a few words now. Let's bring it down instead of big picture. Let's bring it down to paragraph. I happen to believe that paragraph is like one of the most foundational parts of writing. And many of our middle and high school students don't have any idea of what a paragraph is. It should begin with a topic sentence that tells you the main idea and then be supported by detailed sentences. Now, we teach young children that a concluding sentence should wrap the paragraph up, but the fact of the matter is, once you're beyond grade 3 or 4, most writing will not have a concluding sentence at the end of every paragraph. There are some things we can do to teach students and have them practice writing paragraphs. I've got several of them on the slide here, right? Give them a bunch of sentences. One is the topic sentence, but they're all scrambled and they have to pick out the topic. Another thing is give them a bunch of sentences, throw in a sentence that doesn't belong. And then you can also have them create a topic sentence. But the one that I do have time to share with you is color coding. And here we're bringing in some model text. So I found this paragraph in a middle school science textbook. It was structured perfectly. So I can use this as a model to say, look at how this author wrote this paragraph. We're going to highlight topic sentences in green, supporting sentences in yellow. And if there is a conclusion, we'll do it in red. So we do it through model text, and then eventually we want it to carry over into the student's writing. And here you can see the student is now highlighting their own writing, and it's a great way to reinforce the parts of a paragraph. Another thing in here is patterns of organization. I'm sure you're familiar with these, right? These are the 5 basics. Describing is a whole lot easier than comparing and contrasting. Sequence is also an easy pattern of organization, but often our students aren't even aware of what these things are. It can help their comprehension if we make them aware of patterns when they read, and then it also helps their writing when we have them think through what you want to write, which of these types or patterns is the best for your purpose for your writing. And then connected to these are these all important transition words and phrases. They're sometimes called linking words. Our students who have language deficits, oftentimes are dyslexic students who have not read a lot, they only own a few transitions and they use the same ones over and over again. And what we want to do is provide explicit instruction and give them scaffolds, such as this kind of a thing. So if you look on the right, this is a list of transition words that are organized by purpose. I have been giving this out since 1978. Hand out something like this to your students. If you're working with young ones, you can make it simpler. I've given you a link down at the bottom to a free resource section on my website. You can download this. I get thousands of people every month downloading this from the website. You can make posters, such as the example that you see over on the left. All right, let's shift gears now to sentences, because along with paragraphs, I truly believe sentences are the building blocks of writing. And, you might remember a little bit earlier in the session, I was talking about how the transcription skills of spelling and handwriting are essential, but so are basic sentence writing abilities. Now, when we create a sentence, what do? I want you to imagine that each of these Lego blocks is a word, and we literally build a sentence by stacking a bunch of words together. And those words have to be in the right order. That's grammar, right? And so that last item on the right, let's imagine that's a sentence. How do we build a paragraph? Well, we take several of those sets of Legos, stick them next to each other, right? And then, those big Lego pieces that have a big, like lots of dots, if we put that on top of all of those sentences, That's like putting a topic sentence on the top of our paragraph and it holds all of our sentences together. We can keep the metaphor going. How do we build a multi-paragraph piece? Well, if we've got one chunk of those sentences, a paragraph, and we add another one and another one and another one, what have we just built? A whole article. And then how do we build a chapter and eventually a book? So this metaphor I've found to be very helpful with teachers, but also with students to get them to understand that sentences truly are the building blocks. Part of what we have to do is develop students what's known as syntactic awareness. And the way that we can do that, I'll jump back to this in a minute, is to do activities such as the ones listed here. I'm going to, in a minute, show you some sentence combining activities. Highly researched as effective to improve the sentence and writing and syntactic knowledge of kids across all grade levels. But there are several other things that you can do as well. Once again, I've given you a link. I write a literacy blog every month. I've been doing it since 2015. And about a year or so ago, two of them are two blog posts, give you very detailed descriptions about how you can do some of the others. But I do want to come back to this quote from Bruce Sadler, who's done an awful lot with sentence instruction and written several books about it. I love this quote that Bruce gives about how complicated it is to deal with sentences. And as he says, of the many difficulties writers encounter, it's crafting the sentences that can really trip us up. So a little bit about sentence combining. Here's your practical takeaway. It has been around for a while, a lot of research supporting it. Let me give you some simple examples. If I asked you to put these two sentences into one coherent sentence, I'm sure you could do it. It might look something like this. Here's another one. And this is how you begin sentence combining. You give kids two very simple sentences and you have them combine them. But I want you to see where it can go. This is a very advanced example. In this case, I took a sentence from a science text that was very long, and I broke it up, I deconstructed it into 7 shorter sentences. We don't have time in a session like this, but if I asked you to combine all of these into one long, grammatically correct sentence, I know you could do it. It would take time. But what I want you to see here is that you can begin with really simple sentence combining. And as the students get better at it and they get older, you can end up doing more advanced sentence combining with them. You can do it in any subject. All right, our last strand, because we're running out of time here, is critical thinking. And this is where I tucked in, number 1, the stages of the writing process. So let's talk about this. A pair of researchers, Hayes and Flowers, did some research starting in the 1960s, trying to identify what are the stages that a good writer goes through. And if we can figure out what they are, then maybe we can teach them. And so the notion of stages of our writing process has been around for a while. It's actually one of the standards in a lot of state writing standards, teach kids the stages, right? This is a little simple reminder, sort of like an abbreviation that we've used here at Keys to Literacy. We call it think, plan, write, revise. And you can see that there are some sub-steps under each one. So under planning, you want to make sure you use a graphic organizer or a guide, right? But the TPWR, it's meant to help remind kids. Now, what is that arrow? Well, the arrow is there because we also have to teach kids to not skip. Don't skip, don't go right to writing. But we also teach them that you can go back and revisit stages. It is a dynamic process, that a piece of writing is never finished. So when you're revising, you might go back to writing, or when you're writing, you might go back to more thinking. The other part of this strand has to do with all the skills involved with writing to learn. So this was one of the reports I mentioned to you. And what they found is when we teach kids to write personal reactions to text, maybe write a journal entry about a story we're reading, when we teach them to write summaries of what they read, to take notes, and to literally write out answers to questions, it improves their writing and their reading. Because writing is thinking. when we write, it forces us to organize our thoughts, solidify our understanding, right? It gets us engaged. Even little quick writes can be helpful. How many of you write a grocery list and you forget it at home? And when you get to the store, even though you forgot it, the fact that you wrote it helps you remember. And that's a very simple example, but that's the point writing is thinking. Now, this brings us back to the explicit instruction point. We can't assume kids are going to figure the skills and strategies out on their own, especially our struggling writers. So we've got to make sure we teach them how to read that source and annotate it. How do you take notes? How do you add evidence in notes? How do you plan your writing? How do you use a graphic organizer, whether it's a topic web or an outline, right? How do you take a phrase in your notes and blow it up into a really good sentence? What about text structure? What about headings and features? We've got to explicitly teach all of these things. And let's remember that when students are not able to write a quality response to a prompt, it might be their writing that's the problem, but it also might be their comprehension skills. And we need to address both. All right, so I'm going to end this, and this does give us a few minutes for some Q&A. A couple big ideas I want you to take away from the writing rope. Number one, that writing instruction must address multiple components. You can't just focus on one or two. Number two, all teachers can play a role. We need everyone's help. Number three, the instruction must be explicit. And the last one, this is not a real word, but I bet you can figure out what I meant for it to mean. We have to avoid committing a suicide. And that means we assume that our students, especially as they get older, have all of these skills that are in the left of the writing rope, and they don't. And we have to make sure that we find out which ones they need help with, and we go back in and we explicitly teach them. So that's the end of the formal presentation. Jessica, you want me to jump to this? What
That's perfect. Yes, thank you, Joan, for that wonderful presentation. And I will just take a minute to point to our companion document that we create to accompany each webinar. Here you will find our companion document. The link will be in the chat shortly. And then you can also find webinar companion documents and recordings at scoe.net/CA dyslexia. So we do have some time maybe for one or two questions. If you would just, Joan, move to the next slide, which is our webinar survey. If you could fill out that survey, those of you who are on the call, and we will continue to ask Joan questions while you're filling that out. That would be great. So the first question we got was, schools tend to defer to spell check, instead of providing spelling instruction. What do you recommend?
Well, so it really depends on what the focus of your lesson is, right? And I think this is not just about spell check, but there's lots of technology out there. And boy, we're all hearing about, IA, right? Or AI, right? Look, I think I worked teaching so many older dyslexics, and many of them, people gave up on them learning to read and write and spell, right? And I know that with some explicit intervention that's taught by a specialist, we can move the kids' spelling and reading up. So you should never abandon it. On the other hand, if you have a 16-year-old student and they're trying to compose and write and learn through their writing, do you really want to bog them down with worrying about their spelling, right? And so, sure, use spell check. We have to let them know that it's not always perfect. We've all seen the jokes about that, right? Or just create an environment where it's okay for kids to misspell things. I think if that's part of what being a dyslexic is going to be about, then why punish kids for that? So that's my short answer to that one. Yeah.
I like it. Thank you. And then I will just sneak one more in because I think it's a relevant one. Do you have any recommendations for curricula that are strong models of high quality writing instruction?
Yeah. So the question, I'm not sure if they mean curricula or do they mean a program? They might mean both. I don't know. one thing I will say is, there's not a lot out there. There's some good things that I've seen, some good intervention programs, right? But I want you to keep this in mind. If you think about everything that I covered here today, with maybe the exception of spelling, right? Where if you're going to teach phonics, it is really helpful to have things like letter sound cards and decodable text and right. And decodable text to develop fluency, things like that. So I think you do need materials to teach that. But if you're teaching comprehension and developing vocabulary and teaching kids many of these writing skills, you don't need handouts. You don't need a program. I think the answer is teachers need the foundational knowledge because it's the teacher that teaches the writing, not the program. And we forget the important role that teachers have. And especially if you're going to integrate this instruction into whatever you're teaching in all subjects. So you can do sentence combining. You don't need to buy a book or a program for that, right? You can teach kids to use transition words. Have them practice writing the things I shared about text structure when they're writing an opinion piece in history or in science. So I really think it's the knowledge of the teacher that matters most. And this is a good way to end this. That's why I put the writing framework, rope framework together, so that teachers, if you are going to develop a curriculum, then make sure it covers all of these different pieces in the writing rope. So that's a good way to end this, I think.
That's perfect. Well, Joan, thank you so much for the time you spent with us today. On behalf of Glean Education, the Sacramento County Office of Education, and the California Dyslexia Initiative, thank you for our wonderful attendees for coming all year. And we look forward to see you next year for our webinar series. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Joan.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joan. That was great. That was action-packed.
Yeah, I know. I planned a little more than I really had time for, but we got it in. So
It
Yeah,
was
thank you.
absolutely
Great. It
wonderful.
was
thanks, everybody.
I'll follow up via email.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye-bye. Have a great afternoon.